Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today on this webinar. I'm Don Witruba, the Executive Director for MASB, for those that are new to this. We're going to talk about budgeting today. You know, we've done these Member Matters webinars. This might be our third or maybe fourth one now. And it's really an opportunity for you to share with each other. But I also understand coming on, there's probably still some interest in what's happening at the state level from a budget and what's happening at the federal level. And so I do have Jen Smith, our Director of Government Relations, to talk about that a little bit, and then we will go into the discussion to share what your districts are doing from a budgeting. I've already heard from board members and SUPs, kind of a variety of different ways that people are budgeting with all the unknowns that we have. But I wanted to start in one different place. You received a message from me, I guess it would have been last Friday, announcing that we are moving the annual conference to a virtual conference for the fall of the year. And I just wanted to spend a little time while I had 100 or so of you sitting here to talk about that. If you didn't get a chance to see the video of last week that I shared, on May 15th, we had a board meeting and had some discussion with our board of directors. I've been doing a lot of research with other national nonprofits and state nonprofits, what they were doing. MASA has already moved their fall meeting into a virtual space. And a number of our states, counterparts in other states, had moved in that same direction. And in making that decision for us, it was a couple of things came into play. One, we don't know what the fall is going to be like. To try to put together a conference where we knew we'd be bringing, 800 people together in a confined space. From a member safety perspective, we had concerns with that. We also didn't want to be in a situation where we were planning for face-to-face and we had a state order that in September or October would tell us that we couldn't do the meeting, and thus put us in a place to not be able to provide a good learning experience for board members. So we made the decision to do it early. So that our staff that puts together our conference could put together the same or a better quality conference that you come to expect from MASB, and do it in a virtual format. And for us, that means we'll likely have to pick up software that's going to be able to run a virtual conference. We haven't figured out exactly how it's going to run, whether it's going to run over 2 days like it normally does, or whether we're going to spread it out. But we do believe that we will bring you a conference that will be one that you can learn just like you always have. And maybe we can even get more people to participate. I know cost and travel are always a factor in the conference for people, distance. And this year, the other piece and the other decision that I and the board of directors made, knowing where districts were going to be, knowing that often we make sacrifices in professional development, both for you as board members and your SUPs and your teachers when money is what it is. And at least in the short term, we didn't want that to get in the way for learning. We've been fortunate over the last 5 years through, the times that you have interacted with our organization and hired us to do consulting work and other things that we've been able to put money away. And so we are offering the annual conference this fall for free to all board members and superintendents that wish to attend. We think that that is just the least that we can do as an organization to provide you access to quality training in the fall. And we still have some work to do on figuring out the delegate assembly. We have to have one face-to-face if we're going to do voting. And so we're having some conversations with that. Brad Banasek, our attorney, is doing some research on that, and we'll announce how that's going to go in the upcoming months. But figured I had an opportunity to share with you on this, our decision to move to the virtual conference. I think you're going to see a lot of that from a lot of organizations throughout the fall and into next year. And we just wanted to do it early to keep your safety in mind and keep a quality program in place for all of you. If you have any questions, either today, you can throw up a question in the chat box. Happy to address that. If you have them, if something comes to you in the future, please email me at the office or give me a call. Happy to chat more about our decision to go in that direction, but wanted to share that with all of you. With that, Again, a thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing in your districts. I know that you've made a big pivot from continuity of learning plans to now thinking about how do you reopen in the fall? How do you deal with budget? None of the decisions are easy. And I think that you're going to have detractors no matter what decisions you make at this point. And it's not a fun space to be in for members. I hope those of you that are on the call, particularly the board members, those that are up for election this year are saying, I'm going to run again because it's the right thing to do and my district needs me. And if you've got some vacancies, you know, really kind of sharpen your pencil on the recruitment side of things, because quality board members coming into the upcoming couple of years is going to be important. You can go to our website, look at our Get On Board campaign, and there are sample pieces of information for recruitment of board members, board job description, and other items, because that will be a big piece of what some districts will have to take on this year as they had board members stepping down. Any questions in that space right now before I go to Jen and have her start talking, just to give us a brief update on what's happening at the state and federal level on budget? Any questions on conference, Get On Board and attracting board members, or anything else? And we'll do at the end, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions in that space too. You can go in to click on participants and raise your hand, or you can type in the chat that you would like to ask a question at any time during this. I'm not seeing any, and that's completely fine. So I'll turn, Jen Smith, if you could spend a little time talking to us about what is happening on the budget front, just to get our members queued up on what to be expecting. And I know we're still in a time of unknowns.
Yeah, I would love to tell you what to expect, but I can't. As usual, when I talk to all of you, I have all the good news. We know from the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference that the school aid fund will be down more than $1 billion, about $1.25 billion for this year, another $1 billion for next year, $750 million for the year after that. We're not looking at any sort of recovery in that fund until probably 2022. And that's if things start to open up and stay open. That's if we don't have a second round of a COVID-19 outbreak. So if we were to go the route of proration, which would be the state budget office has to trigger that and says with them and Treasury, we do not have the money to cover this fiscal year. And so we have to make these changes. A proration, you're looking at about $650 to $700 per pupil cut, and that would be now. That would be between now and September 30th. And I know with your budgets closing in less than 30 days and your new fiscal year starting, this is all really frustrating that we can't tell you anything better. The school business officials have been doing a pretty good job of keeping, well, a really good job of keeping their members apprised of what's going on. They've been suggesting that districts come up with multiple budgets for July to pass, to have something in place for July. There is not going to be any sort of increase. I think even a flat budget is probably too high right now because we're going to have to see some sort of cut. The reason we're hearing that this is all being delayed, that we haven't had the proration talk, the legislature hasn't put together a negative supplemental, and just to stop for a second, the difference between those is a proration is a flat across the board. Everybody who gets money out of the school aid fund gets cut at that $650 to $700 per pupil. So that would be locals, charters, ISDs, community colleges, universities, all of them. A negative supplemental allows the legislature to go in and pick the line items they cut. So then they can determine how much they want to move around between line items, how much they want to take out to get to that $1 billion number. So those are the two possibilities to balance the budget. We have not seen either. Some of our conversations with the legislature have been frustrating. Comments from some of the Senate Republicans have been, well, this is of her doing, so the governor needs to fix it. And it's breaking down in Lansing if it's not already there, because you have the pushback that we should be involved in all of the decisions as far as stay home, stay safe, and emergency declarations. But then you flip the coin to the budget side and like, well, she has to do that. So it's frustrating to figure out who is going to make these decisions. And I don't know that anybody has stepped up to make these decisions. The other thing we're hearing, part of the governor's reluctance to act yet, is the push for the federal government to act. So we're asking for the federal government to act, one, to give flexibility to the COVID money that was sent to the states that is not education related. So the money that came to states in that separate pot that's not school related says that it can only be spent on things that were not appropriated for before COVID-19. So it's only new programs going forward that are COVID related. What many governors have been asking for, ours included, is flexibility in that, to take that line out so that they could use some of that money that has flowed into the state to backfill our revenue hole so that they don't have to cut programs. So then they could take the 600 million or however much we got, blanking on the number. I was mixing up the Senate number with the budget number, but they could take those millions and put it into programs where there's going to be a budget hole. But right now the federal government will not allow that to happen. The money that's flowing to the districts through CARES is very flexible. So there is some confusion about that when we talk about flexibility for CARES money, but it's inadequate. So what we've been asking for, you've seen our alerts, you've seen our sample board resolution, is to push the federal government to fund schools better and with more money. Ideally, we need $3 to $5 billion for our school aid fund over the next 3 years in order to keep us from these massive cuts. I don't know that we'll get that out of the federal government, but they did just pass a $5 trillion budget or aid package out of the House. So it's not unheard of to ask for that, knowing what numbers they're throwing around out there. But we really need the groundswell of support to talk to our congresspeople, to tell them that we need recognition that states can't necessarily cut their way out of this. And states cannot carry a deficit into their fiscal year. So we have to have a balanced budget by September 30th. And if we don't have an influx of other money, of federal money, we're gonna have a hole that we have to cut our way out of. And the general fund is in worse shape than the school aid fund. So any idea about, well, we can sort of shift money around is really out the window. The general fund is about at $1 3/4 billion this year. So there's a lot that we need to do. And the federal government, unfortunately, is who we need to look to at this time. So unfortunately, I don't have any other good information for you, only bad, well, information, just not details. As we find out more, I will certainly pass it on. But the last reading we got, and if you saw the governor's press conference last week, she spent the whole time talking about federal money. And we're getting the feeling from her staff that there will not be a decision made on our budget until we know what the feds are going to do. And that makes it really hard on all of you, and we know that. But unfortunately, there's not much we can do to get that to move. But we do ask all of you to keep pressure on your federal counterpart, or your federal people, your senators, your congressperson, or your representative, and urge them to help the states out.
Jen, we'll give members an opportunity to ask you some questions too. I have one. In the original CARES package, they did pass on some aid from the feds to the states. I think Michigan was what, $389 million or something like that. Have there been any discussions? Is that money that they would use in the current year, or are they looking at maybe using that in next year's budget? Because that is not taken into account in the shortfall right now that's been put out there with the consensus revenue conference. At least I didn't believe it was.
It can't be, because it can't be used for programs that have already been appropriated for. It can be used for new programming. So the Senate passed Senate Bill 690 2 weeks ago, and it's coming up in the House this week. And it's all new programming because that's all we can use it for. So it's COVID related, but it can't be to fill DHHS for our EBT cards. It can only be going forward. And that's part of the problem, is that, yeah, we got over $300 million, but we have to use it going forward. We can't use it for anything that we're currently paying for.
And as I understand from Superintendent Rice, that is money that would, at the point that they distribute it out through districts, that will be distributed through the normal kind of payment system that we use.
Yeah, and when the schools get the money, that's different. The schools they're more wide open what they can use the money for. And it's supposed to be appropriated through Title I counts. And when the school district receives the money, the list of things you can use it for is very broad. So there's more flexibility for districts than there is for the states when it comes
Yeah,
to
that's I was referring to the district money that
Yeah,
schools would get.
Yeah, unfortunately, because of the way the CARES Act was written, you have to be specific. So the school money does not have the strings that the state money has.
Looking at the chat function, House Bill 267, which doesn't sound like it's the right number, requests that the federal government not give the state any more funding, and is sponsored by 10 House members. This should be shared and discouraged.
It's House Resolution 267. It is sponsored by 10 House Republicans saying that the federal government should not bail out the states. There's a lot of anger from a lot of other people about this, especially out of the school community. I know the West Bloomfield Soup sent out a letter to his entire district telling them to contact these reps, named them by name and contact information to tell them that this is unacceptable. We're not going to be able to cut our way out of this. We are actually working with our counterparts at MASB and MASA to put together a counter resolution for introduction by a more reasonable contingent of school supporting Republicans to push Congress to aid schools and states. We're hopeful that we can have that done by the beginning of next week. And if so, you will certainly all hear from us, because we would rather push something proactively than keep calling attention to this resolution that really is tone deaf to what the state needs.
And Jen, I haven't heard you say anything about this, and I just think that we haven't really been full bore with the legislature yet. Any chance of a suspension of the watch list for districts that go below 5%, as we would expect?
We have been working on that. We've been in pretty constant conversation with the governor and with Treasury on this. I don't have answers from them yet. Last I was told, it was, we're having internal conversations, we'll get back to you. But we have been talking to them about this since before CREC, and then when CREC happened and we knew we had such a hole, we came back to them. MSBO thinks that we could have over half our districts, so over 400 districts, that will fall below 5% of their fund balance, which would trigger every one of them to be reviewed by Treasury. Some cynically say, leave it on Treasury and make them review us all. They don't have the personnel, maybe that would cause them to suspend it. But we are trying to get that changed. I don't know where Treasury is going with it, because every answer I get when I follow up is we're having internal conversations. But it's definitely on people's radar screens to look at that law and figure out what we do with it next, because it's certainly not going to apply the way it's intended for the next couple of years.
Rich asked a question about the CARES Act, saying that it was limited to at-risk and low-income programs. That's actually how it's distributed, though, is based on your numbers.
Not limited, distributed.
Pete asked the question, you kind of addressed it in your proration, but any discussion, flat cuts versus percentage cuts, or kind of a reverse 2X, which we've had in other years when we've had conversations about proration versus legislative negative supplemental?
Because the legislature is not engaging, at least on the Senate side, is not engaging in a conversation about a negative supplemental, it's hard to know what they would do. Proration is just flat across the board. It doesn't take into account 2X, it doesn't take into account equity, none of that. It is just across the board, that is what's done. Without knowing what's happening behind closed doors, I don't know what they're talking about. And the last conversation we had with the chair of the Senate K-12 Appropriations Committee was, we're waiting for the governor to tell us. So it's frustrating from our end that we can't get answers. But I don't think they have answers either. I honestly don't think they know.
Any movement on safeguards for student enrollment? I know some people have talked about the idea, can we have the 2019 numbers because of what, parents that won't be sending kids to school and all of that? What are you hearing from legislators on that?
We have been talking to legislators about two different pieces that affect that. The 75% required attendance to count it as a day of instruction, waiving that for the upcoming school year for multiple reasons. Parents may not want to send their kids back. We may be looking at a different way of attendance. We may still be looking at some online. We have no idea. So we're asking for that in the upcoming budget to have that waived. And then second is pupil count. And the idea that, again, if we don't have all of our kids in school in October, it's going to affect our pupil count, it's going to affect our funding, and we can't budget on that. So what we've asked for and requested is using the greater of last fall or this fall's count, which would allow you to budget on last fall and February's count, which are numbers you know, versus the unknown. We've gotten some pretty positive feedback about that, but again, we don't know where they're going with the budget yet, but those are conversations that we are having with legislators.
Any discussion on temporary relief or reprieve related to MIPSR's rate or contribution?
MIPSR's is like a hot potato. There's been talk of bonding, which we oppose. There's been talk of stretching the payments. There's been requests to not put the 100 million of the state money in to buy it down. But we don't know where that's going. The most talked about idea was to stretch the payments, which would free up money in the school aid fund to put into other things. We have asked for any change to MIPSR's, any relief from MIPSR's that allows more money to flow into the school aid fund should go to the entities that pay into MIPSR's. It shouldn't just be spread out across everybody in the school aid fund. But we don't know what exactly to expect out of that.
Any talk on Michigan merit changes? I know that we're going into we're talking more of a policy question there, but it also can change what programs are offered at a school district, if they're going to have them or not.
This is a project that we've just started. We, being myself and some of my lobbyist counterparts from other organizations, is putting together, we've looked at the EO 65. We've compiled every single law that is waived in that, a ton. And so what we're looking at now is pulling out pieces of that affect curriculum, that affect day-to-day operations, and seeing what can we ask for to continue into the new school year? And what can we ask for, frankly, to just get out of law? If we waived it now and we don't need it, why do we need it back? So there's sort of two pieces to looking at that EO, but we are in the process of pulling together what we as a large group can take to the governor and to the legislature and say, this is relief we need in the coming year. This is relief that we think is just unnecessary, and sort of go from there. So it's pages of EO of laws that have been suspended or delayed and all of that. We're also looking at the boilerplate things that deal with the school aid budget, things that she has waived this year that maybe we can get changed in boilerplate as we go forward. So all of those things are sort of happening now behind the scenes, and it's still very much a work in progress.
The last question that I see is kind of falls into what you just explained, probably, is seat time waivers to try to offer flexibility to districts and offering online learning versus face-to-face. That's something I know that we'll have to address in some way, whether it's done through seat time waivers or not.
And I think that's going to be part of how do schools open in the fall and what do we need to look at. But if we can get some of these other things in law, seat time waivers won't be as necessary. We keep pointing out everything we're doing right now in our continuity of learning plans is technically illegal without the executive orders. And that's what we need you to talk about. And that's what we need you to look at and change.
And Jen just mentioned, returning to school plans. And you all know that the governor announced she already had a state level task force with department folks, Department of Ed, Health and Human Services, and others. She is now creating a public body to look at this. I don't think she's announced those members yet, but likely this week. And under that, the Department of Ed has also created task forces, urban, rural, and suburban, to inform Superintendent Rice as he engages in those discussions with the rest of the task force on what people in the field are thinking. And so there's a number of superintendents that are sitting on those. I am sitting on the rural task force, trying to help make that, kind of make our thoughts known, not just MASB, but in general, and at least the way that they're all running out of the Department of Ed is to bring a lot of people together, have people out in the field kind of narrow it to like, here's the big issues that we have to deal with. So like a seat time waiver might be, one of those items, so that we can have an ask of here's all the like laws or changes that would need to happen to give us the flexibility to do what we need to do to run school in the fall. Here's what we need to do, and to give advice to districts. Here's some ideas on transportation if we have to do social distance. It's the gamut of returning to school, and those groups are really looking at that to help inform the governor's task force in that space. So let's see. One of our members applied to serve on the Return to School Advisory Council. Actually, three of them so far. No more questions. I know you may have some. I do want to spend some time. We got about a half an hour left, and I do want to give all of you to share. I know we've got some soups on the call today too, board members. I think topics here that are worthy of discussion is, what are you doing at the district level? If you're passing a budget, are you doing 650 or 700? Are you doing a flat budget from last year and going to make an amendment in August when you know more information? Have you started conversations with your teachers groups? Because very clearly, if the cuts that we're talking about come into play, I've talked to a lot of districts and they don't even have the fund balance if they kept all expenditures flat from last year to make it work if their teachers and others aren't there. I see, John, you have your hand up, so you can be the first one to share. Others, either throw in the chat that you're interested in answering a question or throw your hand up.
Hi, Don. Thank you. Last night we had our first reading of our 2020-2021 budget in there, and a couple of things that we put out is we're going based on a $650 reduction in the foundation allowance in here. All of our associations, we have 4 different ones in our district, and there no increases whatsoever in there. And we're going to end with a 5.7% fund balance and a $4.5 million deficit that we'll take out of our present fund balance in here. So,
and John, just a follow-up question: when you say your 4 units are flat, are you in a contract year this year, or did you have a contract out?
Yeah, all 4 of them were up this year.
Okay, so that's different than if you had to like reopen and do something along those lines.
Right.
For one question, Jennifer asked, this year or next or both. If you're willing to talk about either or, that's fine. But I will actually go to Jeff Brown if you want to unmute, and we'd be happy to hear what you're doing for this year.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Very similar to the previous gentleman. We're planning $650 per student reduction at this point for this year, and have calculated what impact that therefore has on our fund balance, which would reduce it significantly. And we are in the process. We have reopeners with several of our bargaining units, and are in those discussions. Actually, discussions have gone quite well so far. There seems to be a broad understanding of the challenges. As far as next year goes, we're building a budget based on, again, $650 reduction. And we are willing to reduce our current fund balance, which is about 11.2 to about 6% to absorb some of that, but it will still require about $2.5 million worth of cuts beyond that. Our finance committee had already created, for other reasons, a list of about 850,000 in cuts. So it's not quite as big a reach as if we were starting from scratch, but that certainly is significantly more. So that's what we're looking at this point, and certainly was one of the reasons why we're interested as a district in whether Treasury and the legislature will make some changes to the trigger for the 5% watch list.
And Jeff, if you could share what district, I forgot to ask that when you speak, sharing what district.
Yeah, Gull Lake Community Schools.
All right. let's see, Pete, you want to share what you're doing with your budget and your district?
Yeah, so I'm in Van Buren Public Schools, which is in Wayne County. We are planning for a $550 cut right now. We just at our last board meeting last week laid off 15 teachers. Through attrition, it's going to be a total of 24 and a half teachers that are going to be, we're not refilling or not doing. So that gets us to about a $400 per student cut right there. So we still have a little bit more ways to go. We have a couple more. We have a board meeting on Monday. We have a couple other positions going. We're also going to look at some administrators coming up too. We did have a provision in our teacher's contract. We just signed a 2-year teacher's contract. And we had a provision in there. So we just happened to put it in that if we lose $100 or more in per pupil funds, we have an automatic reopen. So that'll help too. So.
That was a good negotiation there. If you got that in, or at least somebody that could see the future.
Yeah, I got lucky.
Jennifer Goodman, you asked the question earlier for this year or next, so I'm assuming that you might want to shed some light on what you're doing in your district. Or maybe not. Others that want to throw up their hand and share what's happening with your teaching units, what you're doing with your budgets. I talked to 2 districts, I don't know, a week or 2 ago. They have been fortunate to put together fund balances over the last few years. They're hovering just about 15%. And they said if they were to leave spending flat from this current year's budget, not make any changes, their 15% fan balance, both of them said they would drop to under 1% if they stayed in that space for 1 year. So when you start looking at those kind of numbers, and we think about the 5% threshold of Treasury, those are big, and you clearly would have to have some conversations with your teaching and other units in your district if you're going to go from 15 to 1. Like, that's pretty untenable in 1 year. And we know, as Janet just explained, that we're going to, this is not a 1 year problem. This is a multi-year problem. I see a question pop up. Are districts discussing the potential loss of FTEs in their budgeting process if parents look at other education options, if schools do not open face-to-face or even as a blended model? That's a great question. If you're a board member and or a superintendent and you've begun those conversations, I've heard a little bit of it in just kind of the grapevine where, we have districts that I've talked to that are saying 10% of my parents say we're not going to send their kids in the fall. 30% of their parents aren't going to send them in the fall. And if a school doesn't come up with an online option, very likely they could. In Michigan, of course, we have online charter schools that have been in operation, and parents could look to that. And that could be a significant loss in students for some districts if the parents make that choice and the district isn't able to spin up some kind of offering, even if they're contracting with a company to provide online learning. So I would ask, have any districts started those conversations about what happens if we lose X number of kids at high school level or whatever it is, and can you do layoffs in September when you find out, oh, wait a second, we have 10% less kids in our high school than we thought we were going to have? I don't see anybody jumping out saying that is something that they have, at this point, spent a lot of time in doing. And I do think it's one of those that it's hard to share or hard to see into the future. I see Linda Van Houten.
Yeah, I can share. We have put in a plan for 3 phases. I think everybody's looking at that also, either all in person or all online or the hybrid. But we've already put out to our parents that we will have an option of all online if parents are not feeling safe to send their students. And we actually have had to add a part-time position to help manage K-12 online opportunities for students. So had to add that to our budget cuts. Our cuts are similar to everybody else. We're looking at a $650 per pupil this school year and a $700 per pupil next school year. It's equating to about a $3.2 million cut for the school district. Will take us down to about a 4% fund balance. Cutting about 12 professional staff, but moving around people to different positions and filling retirements to the tune of about 35 different staff.
What district, Linda?
Greenville.
All right, thank you. Pete, I see you posted, you've started talking about expanding your online program.
Yeah, so we currently, this past year, we just started a 9-12 program, primarily for kids who just weren't successful in the traditional high school. And then we were going to move it to 7 through 12 this coming year. But in the last couple of months, we started now that we've just advertised our families it's going to be K-12. A lot of interest so far. And a lot of people were not planning on coming back, at least at the beginning part of the fall. They said they were going to wait till November, December to see what happens. And again, we are in Wayne County, so we've been hit pretty hard down here. But we are going to see what happens. Instead of just totally losing those kids, we figured we might as well get some funding for them. We don't need to have the same class sizes in our online school, so we think it'll help our in-person school where we can end up having smaller class sizes than we may have had otherwise if we wouldn't have done that. So if we need to lay off more teachers, as when the whites of their eyes don't walk through our doors, we'll end up laying more off than planned.
And in your program, Peter, when you're offering it online, are you using your current teaching staff that you have, or is that something that you're using a provider for?
We're going to be using Michigan Virtual, so we still need some mentors. Okay. So we're going to be offering that to a lot of our laid off teachers who are on layoff right now. We can just bring them back doing some of that work. All
right, tremendous. I see a few others have shared, so make sure you're paying attention to the chat. So where people are sharing ideas instead of speaking, please read those so that you're aware. Others that want to share kind of solutions that you're thinking about for the fall of the year, just to help out those districts here that maybe haven't made up their mind or haven't been able to do it. I see one person posting that they've been encouraging online or out of school options, but maybe not getting as much traction as possible. I do see Jen just posted, it won't be significant, but private schools are worried parents won't be able to or want to pay tuition for their schools, and will look to public options. And this plus parent concerns that everybody is raising is why we're working for a known pupil count. Yeah, if we go back to 2008, 2009, when we were in the last recession, private schools in Michigan took a pretty big hit. They had a lot of people that were out of work. Public schools actually saw a growth in numbers in certain areas where you had private schools close. It's unclear as people come back to work right now in this forced layoff because of the pandemic, what it's going to look like if businesses are going to spin back up to full capacity and employment won't be hit very hard this fall. But if it is, very clearly, I think Jen's point is valid. And we're going to you might have new people knocking on your door looking for educational options that you didn't have a year ago. Other thoughts? Let's see. Howard, is the MEA sending any direction to the locals about resisting freezing and salary steps? And that would be, I see Pete shaking his head, yes. We have been working on this at the state level with the MEA. I think where they are right now is they're not trying to be contrary at the local level necessary, but their issue is they really want to keep the pressure up to try to get some funding into districts before we go down the line of cutting teachers' salaries. And I don't think most superintendents and most boards want to go down the road of cutting salaries or laying off teachers either. But unlike the teachers union, you all have to pass a budget in June. And so there are tough decisions that you're going to have to make. And recall is always an option with layoffs, giving, wage reductions back if cuts aren't as big, just like Pete had in his budget. or in his contract where if it was above $100 a kid, there's an automatic reopener. You can put language in a new contract that says if, cuts, end up lower than anticipated, then, X, Y, or Z will happen. So that can all be dealt with. But I have heard from other districts too, that at the local level, at least the MEA is pushing right now not to move in that direction. And I think it's more of a political leverage piece than it is a realization that it might still have to happen in the end. Other questions? Has anyone discussed transportation based on the CDC recommendations? We bus 80% of our students covering a vast area. We can't handle it or make it happen. Yeah, that is a discussion I know on the rural task force that I'm on because of the type of districts that are on there. Busing is a huge issue. The numbers of kids that you can get on a bus probably are no more than a third of what you would normally put on a bus. And, so you hear about districts talking about multiple routes in a day. You hear districts talking about every other day type situations to split up. You talk about districts saying, I might be better off, offering online options to every kid that is able to do that so that I have fewer kids to take a bus. And those are the variety of things I've heard. If anybody here has come up with an idea in your district, if you're going to plan on being open this fall, how you're going to deal with busing? Yeah, see, this is, what I'm seeing here is not unlike what I'm seeing in the task force that I'm sitting on. Is districts are trying putting down a variety of options right now. They haven't settled on anything because it's just, so unknown. I see Gratiot Isabella, RESD, Paul just posted that they're beginning discussions in that space. And I think that's where a lot of it. Carol, if you'd like to talk what you're doing in West Bloomfield, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, West Bloomfield has been widely covered in the news media, but some of the specifics haven't been covered. As part of our hybrid plan, the transportation sort of falls under that same umbrella. What we're going to do is split our student body in half. So half the kids will go to school, regular school in much smaller classes on Monday, Tuesday. Nobody will be in our buildings or using transportation on Wednesday. Those will be our cleaning days, both for the buses and for the buildings, because the Monday, Tuesday kids will be a consistent group. And then Thursday and Friday, things will flip. The other half of the kids will be on the buses and in the buildings on Thursday and Friday. There will be an option for full-day childcare in one of our other buildings for the families that need that so that the parents can go back to work, but those children will not be bused into that program. The parents would have to drop off and pick up. So that's how we're dealing with both the transportation and being able to distance in both our buildings and transportation things. We are still looking at, whether we should just cut transportation totally, depending on how many kids actually do return to the classroom. But right now, that is our current plan moving forward as to how to deal with all of it.
Thank you, Carol. Ken Stahl?
Hi, everyone. Carol, you keyed in on something there. We had an idea similar. I think the problem with a lot of these ideas, we've come up with 15 different plans. There's always something in it that dominoes and then, okay, that's going to cost more money, which is something we can't do. The busing issue, we thought about that. Well, what about half these days, half that day? Well, then that's our pupil count. How are we going to account for the pupil count if we don't get some direction from the state? So I think that's why we're all having such difficulty talking, because we've probably all talked it about 13 different ways, and every time you run into a roadblock. We need more information from the state to find out what it's going to look like, I think, before all we can do is have a whole bunch of ideas in our bag of goodies, and when they finally tell us what it's going to look like, pull the ones that work and go. I guess that's where we're at.
Jen, have you heard, and I think in the original announcement, there might some reference to it, but from the governor's perspective, how quickly with both the task force and the next group down that she's creating, the public group, like what's their time frame on trying to make recommendations?
We've heard that advisory council will be named this week. We have been told probably at her Monday or Wednesday usual press conference. As you all know, yesterday's press conference was much bigger about lifting the stay at home. So maybe Wednesday's press conference at 3. She has usual press conferences Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 3 o'clock. So we've been told it would probably be one of these days, so maybe Wednesday. I haven't heard for sure. And then if it gets named this week, it will probably have a month to work and get recommendations to the COVID-19 Education Task Force, which is her internal task force. So the advisory council are the external people that she's bringing in from around the state. The education task force was put in place back in March and is internal with DHHS, Dr. Caldoun, Dr. Rice, and a few others internally. So the advisory council is supposed to make recommendations and thoughts to that. Those two entities are supposed to talk, and we're hoping, we have heard it'd be about a month, and then we would get recommendations at the beginning of July. They wouldn't necessarily be set in stone. At that point, they would be open to feedback. So I don't know for sure if it's going to be a public release at the beginning of July, or if it is a stakeholder release at the beginning of July, and we would get the chance to reach out to you and get feedback that we could give back to her. I don't quite know what their steps are, but that's all I do know right now.
All right, thank you. One of the other busing things that if you are looking at that kind of split situation, or if you're not, one of the other concerns, of course, is many districts are having difficulty even in the current year and past years finding bus drivers. And now you have this, and many of them have, you've hired retirees from their current jobs to be bus drivers. And now there's some, for a lot of districts, real concern that if I have to double up bus routes, I need more bus drivers. They already were hard to find. Now they're going to be harder to find. For some of the population that drives bus, they're in a high risk category. So that makes it even more difficult to put them in a school bus. And so that's another piece that's come up as districts try to struggle with, where do we go from here? And the transportation issue is one of those that comes up. That's another kind of next step that you have to deal with, even if you create a plan trying to move forward with that. Other thoughts, comments about this, or, we're at 10-1 right now. Other questions that you have and on MASB items, budget items. We've covered a bit of the graduation stuff in past meetings. Well, I'd like to open it up and just say what's on your mind, what's worth talking about, what's worth having others answer questions for you if you're looking for some advice. The webinars were put together to be able to share with each other. You guys felt that it was useful to be able to hear what others were doing, to be able to build on it in your district or take advantage of that sharing of information. So I'll make it wide open for any topics right now. If somebody wants to throw something out there, raise their hand or throw something in the chat window. It's not a talkative group today. This is the Zoom fatigue, as they call it. I keep worrying. I see Doug, his picture keeps popping up and he's in a car, and I don't want to be held responsible for what happens as somebody goes down the road with this playing. It sounds like something that I would do. He's parked. I kind of guessed you were, Doug, but I keep seeing the car, so I get nervous on that. My staff often tells me that they don't want to ride with me because Jen's shaking her head. Yes, and so is Stacy, for some of the tales that they've heard about me. You get really skilled when you drive to the UP often, so I won't talk about what I might do or not do when I'm in the car, but let's see. Jeff, actually, I see a great question. Has anyone began to consider what sports and band and extracurriculars look like in the fall? I'm sure some of you have. I have not heard a lot in this space yet. So if you have, what are you thinking, Pete?
So we've had this conversation with our AD a couple times, trying to think about what it could look like. And we're talking about maybe having, and I think they even talked to it as a group of ADs in our conference, possibly having just the family members, if that's possible at that time. So if the athletes playing the game and the only people in the stands are the family members. So we would create a list for our team. Every other team would create a list. We check them at the door. We wouldn't charge admission. They would just be able to come and social distance in the stands themselves, and watch their kids play, but we wouldn't have any crowds.
Okay. Anybody else in that conversation? I know Jen just posted, I was going to say the MHSAA just put out guidance in conjunction with the national organization in that space all the way. And if you've looked at it, it goes right down into the practice space. And I know I've already seen people post like, at this point in any, like, and then we don't usually start until August, but right now it would be difficult to practice like football or basketball as it's currently set up. Let's see, Executive Order 110, opening things up, thoughts and impact. I know, Jen, you and Brad talked about this a little bit yesterday. Any immediate things that you want to mention about 110?
So some of the things that they told us, and we're checking, this is part of the conversation Brad and I were having, is does it apply before or after your continuity of learning plan ends? But with the outdoor gatherings, you can now have 100 people, but you have to be able to socially distance. And in our briefing, they told us this would allow schools to hold graduation ceremonies, but you have to be under 100 people. I hope you can still hear me. There's construction outside my house that started as soon as I unmuted. But the other piece is your outdoor sports facilities can be opened as long as you can have social distancing. I know some districts had closed their tracks and their tennis courts to anybody because we weren't supposed to be using them. As long as there is social distancing, you can hold athletic practices and games, but only if the spectators, fans, and coaches can be 6 feet from each other. This is much to the chagrin of my football and soccer players right now. And then the last piece was picking things up from school. And this is where it might not be able to happen, and maybe Brad is better to answer this, but you are supposed to be able to allow students and parents, teachers, staff to come in and pick things up from buildings because the stay home order has been lifted. But the Executive Order 65 closes those buildings. So that may be a better Brad question.
Any thoughts on that, Brad?
Yeah, all along I've been interpreting that you have to read those two orders together, and the K-12 order, clearly states that it's in place until the end of the school year for a school district. So until a school district ends its school year, according to its plan, I think you're still limited on the amount of people or any folks coming onto school property. You're just limited to parents and guardians coming onto school property to pick up materials in order to further their learning plans. Once the end of the school year occurs, then you would fall back on Executive Order 110, which would allow for the any type of social gatherings on school property up to 10 if it's in a building, or 100 if it's outdoor. One other question, Don, that I've been getting quite frequently is the Open Meetings Act implications with the latest order. Wondering, I know boards out there are dying to have in-person meetings. They're tired of the Zoom virtual meetings. Unfortunately, the most recent executive order still doesn't allow a public open meeting, an in-person meeting. And until we get an order that clarifies that you can have a public in-person meeting, we're going to have to continue our board meetings to be virtual, and have to wait and see what the next executive order states.
Thanks, Brad. I see Mary asked a question about contact information for representatives in Congress, and Jen posted the answer to that to go to our EvaKit site. Eric John posted the question, and you answered it before we got there. Jeff's question about this new model of online, is this where we're going in the future? And our leaders thinking about it, I have to say right now, whether it be district leadership, and I'm not saying this to insult anybody, or particularly state leadership, I mean, right now, the focus is how do we finish this year and how do we get into next year, whether 5 years from now we're, offering a hybrid model to families and parents. It might be a reality, but I don't think many are planning that far ahead. Right now, it's like, just how can we get through next year? And if it works well and things work as parents ask for that kind of delivery model, maybe it comes. But I don't think there's hardly anybody in Lansing in that space thinking, and maybe some individual districts are, but I don't see it as a kind of an immediate space in that regard. There's an alert interest. Get on board documents need to be updated from 2018 to 2020. I'll bring that up. Stacy, I already saw that. They're in process. Brad, I'll ask you a question just because I happen to do it today. Our school, my kid's school is done tomorrow, half day tomorrow. So today they did at the elementary school library book drop off and locker and desk pickup. And so what they did is all the teachers cleaned out desks and lockers, put stuff into bags. They allowed cars to drive through their driveway. They had stations that you could pick stuff up in. I'm not saying my district name today, although I have in the past. In your interpretation, that would probably still not quite clear the regulations because your people are on grounds, but they're not in the school.
Well, I suppose you could say that that's somehow related to furthering the learning plan, ending the school year and ending that plan. So I think you could argue that there is possibly an indirect relationship between that activity and your learning plan, which would allow parents and guardians to be on school property.
Gotcha.
So I will say that's okay.
I see a question that's probably, with regard to our budget hearings and the necessary post to local newspapers, should we still be planning on holding that meeting virtually? And I would say based on 110, that would be still the case.
Yeah, that's what I'm recommending as the best right now, that newspaper notice must include then the link for the virtual meeting. If the next executive order gets relaxed and we're able to have a in-person meeting, you could still conduct that virtually because executive order that 75 that allows for virtual meetings in effect until June 30th. So you could possibly have your in-person meeting for board members and still have a virtual budget hearing. But that would only you could do that only if the next executive order permits an in-person meeting.
And with our budget, or with our briefing yesterday before her executive order came out, I would not expect something like that to change before the end of the month.
And just to clarify too, somebody had posed the question as to whether or not a board meeting could be held outside, and that is still not the case, correct?
I would agree with that, Stacy. Again, that exception that allows outside gatherings of 100 folks is, again, for social gatherings and not public meetings under the Open Meetings Act.
And just to reiterate what Brad's saying, even in our update from the governor's office, when they were asked specifically about meetings, they were told we're talking about social gatherings, not work that can be done remotely.
I mean, there's a real likelihood that we may need to come to grips with. I mean, as the orders kind of showed yesterday, we're letting a lot of things happen, but they're still being pretty firm where, like, I think of MASB from a staff perspective, if you can work remotely, you must work remotely. And because districts have proven over the last few months that remote meetings have worked, they in fact may extend this much into the summer or maybe even longer than that, saying, hey, if there's a chance, if you can do something and not bring a large group of people together, that might be the place that they stay in for a period of time. It may not be the best way to conduct business. We all want to, get back in a room together and do governance, but it may even go beyond the June 30th, depending on the governor and health recommendations in that space. We're just after 1 o'clock right now. I've tried to really honor all of your time and your commitment to be able to let you get back to doing what you're doing. I don't want to ruin that. So I want to thank all of you for participating and sharing. I think these opportunities have been worthwhile. At least I've heard from membership saying that they are. And so thank you very much. And Stacy, I'll ask, do we have another one scheduled 2 weeks from now, or are we right now, this was our last one scheduled? I can't remember.
We have one more scheduled, and it will be on kind of looking ahead to fall is the focus of it. And I
Okay.
believe it is exactly 2 weeks from today.
And we may, when I think of that topic and listen today, I think a lot of districts, the fall is still up in the air. So we might brainstorm about what other topics might be worthwhile. If you have any suggestions on topics that would be worth talking about, you can share them with me directly. You can go to our website, get my email address or Stacy Bogard, and share those. We'll figure that out for a couple of weeks from now. So thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon.